Hi, my name is Romy Kabir, and you're watching UATV. Ukraine has struggled with corruption almost from the day of its independence, from the Wild West privatizations of the 90s to the Yanukovych bandit years and everything in between. Even today, corruption remains one of Ukraine's most pressing problems. According to a poll conducted by the International Republican Institute in 2016, 42% of respondents considered anti-corruption reform to be the #1 priority in the country. In the studio with me today is Yuri Polakiwsky. Welcome, Yuri.
Good to be here with you.
His most recent book, Ukraine, A Lament of a Promise, covers the hopes and dreams of the participants of Ukraine's 2014 Revolution of Dignity.
Yeah, I wrote that as I was not a participant, I was an observer. About 40, 50 times I was there, and I noticed one thing. I noticed that there was a great emotion that was going on during that time, obviously. And what I wanted to do, and what inspired me really, was to, in writing of the book, was to transform or to translate some of that emotion and try to institutionalize the language of freedom, what it means to be a free society, and so on and so forth. And the book was a result of that, just that simple process of institutionalizing the emotion in democratic or free society language. Yeah.
So, speaking of the Maidan Revolution, or the Revolution of Dignity, it's been 3 years since we've had the revolution. How do you think the ideals that have been espoused during that time, how do you think they've survived into present-day Ukraine?
I'm going to say something maybe a little bit controversial. I don't believe the Maidan was a revolution at all. What I believe it was an existential rebellion. And what I mean by that, it was a statement, if you will, by a new generation, what I now call the Maidan Generation, that specifically reacted to the broken promises of President Yanukovych. And what it basically was, in my opinion, it was an existential rebellion that was caused by freedom-loving people in what people aspire to be a free society, and they crossed the Rubicon. Meaning that there was a complete rejection, if you will, of a Marxist-based society and all the fruits, if you will, the rotten fruits, if you will, of previous communist rule. So I don't think it was a revolution per se. What it was a rebellion. Okay? Because I want people to think that it was not a toppling of the Ancien regime, if you will, using the language of the French Revolution, but it was not an American revolution. Right? And God forbid, it was not the Russian Revolution. But what it was that particular rebellion, a place and time where the new generation said no to the past and to the broken promises of the past.
And speaking of that new generation, in next year, in 2019, Ukraine's going to have another election.
Sure.
Now, in the prior election that we had, when the Yanukovych government was toppled or fled, you didn't really see that many kind of new, fresh faces. There were a few. We had Bogomolitsa, the doctor, and we did have a few of the participants, but a lot of them were the same old kind of oligarchs and power-broking elite that we've had in Kyiv, in Ukraine, for the past 20-something years. Do you think this next election will kind of bring out the political consciousness sparked by the Maidan Revolution?
I don't, actually. But let me not be negative there. When I say I don't believe it's going to happen, take under consideration that I left my country, Canada, and I live here, so I have an element of hope. The element of hope is based on, if I can answer the question previous about the ideals. What I think is here, or what is present, are the ideals of what it is to be in a free society. Okay, but defined not by quote European values or even Western values. I'll get to that in a second. But what you see here is you saw a articulation, if you will, of those ideals within a new generation. Let me just say this. What's going on now in Ukraine is, or Ukraine rather, is on two paths here. There is the continuation of the oligarchic state that still exists, and then there's a new class here, a creative class, where which I call the Maidan Generation. I really want to get that across. And these are people that are not talking about what are the values of democracy in a political context. They're not talking about that. What's going to surprise a lot of people here is a lot of people that are 40 and under, right, are already living those values. Free expression, travel, association, tolerance, and so on and so forth. They're already living that. They're already living that, and they're fulfilling their dreams within a Ukrainian context, which they are defining, if you will, what it means to be a Ukrainian in a free society, in a post-communist society, but a free society nonetheless. But getting back to your question, I don't think that generation is ready, by no stretch of the imagination. I had an opportunity to meet some great young people. I worked with them. I was a political consultant in my past life. I wrote and I helped create speeches and so on, but they had no idea of the nuances of electoral politics. And I think that this is one of the things where the West has failed, or the Western governments, and with the amount of money they're spending here. They're not preparing a next generation of hopefully not professional politicians, but people that are going to be affected by principles of democracy. Democracy doesn't exist here yet, but the idealism that happened in the Maidan, that is really present here. And that battle, if I may, that battle has already been won. There is no going back with this generation.
No, you said that democracy doesn't quite exist in Ukraine yet. Going off that, is that in some way indicative of Ukraine's still kind of immaturity as a liberal country? Or is this just the state of Ukraine? This is how Ukraine works.
That's a great question. I would say that if you would agree with me, and I think many people would agree, democracy is based on the rule of law. Okay? So I'm going to ask the question that nobody wants to talk about, nobody wants to ask. 3 years after the Maidan, okay, let me ask you, does the rule of law exist? I would say categorically no. Okay? Categorically no. And I ask you one. I use this example with many people. How many people witnessed the murders on the Maidan? 2 or 3, right? No. Millions of people witnessed the murders on the Maidan. And now, 3 years later, there still has not been, right, the charging of those people who gave the orders, let alone who fulfilled them. Right? There still has not been an accounting for the murders that took place on the Maidan. So how can you ask if Ukraine is a democracy if it cannot even fulfill the key aspect of the dignity of human life, which is that to protect it and to punish those who have transgressed the greatest law of all, which is do not kill. Right? So that would be my answer to you.
Now, so do you believe that as long as there is this kind of pervasive corruption in Ukraine, that where the elites are not held to account, where they do simply get off by whatever reason it is, do you think that democracy simply will not flower until this corruption is stamped out?
If I ask people, and I did, and I asked people on the Maidan specifically, I asked them, can you define for me what does it mean, what does the term rule of law mean? Nobody could actually do it. One of the things that here, especially, forget about the people, the politicians, you call it the elite, it's not an elite at all. What you have to ask yourself is that, do people actually know the definitions, those definitions? If I asked you another question, which I did, and the other question is, what is corruption? Almost 19 out of 20 people would say, well, it's stealing from the government and so on and so forth. I would suggest to you that what is missing here is a greater definition of what corruption is. Corruption in a Western ideal, in a Western sense, is the absence of an ideal. You follow what I'm saying? Meaning that what you have here is corruption. The language here is dealing with, to what do we aspire? Okay, and so when we talk about corruption, you can talk about stealing. You can talk about all those particular things, bribery, all the things that they say in Transparency International and so on. But if you really want to really get down to it, the question remains: corruption is the absence of an ideal, and what you have here still is a dearth of that. People do not know what that means. What is the goal? Meaning, we know what we're against. That was what the Maidan was. But what are we for?
So what does that exactly show? I mean, if you ask the average Ukrainian, do you think the system's going to change? Yeah. Usually, and very often, at least by my personal experience, what you encounter is this kind of shrug and the statement that, well, this is Ukraine. Right. This is the way things are. It oftentimes seems that people are incapable of envisioning kind of this a truly democratically free Ukraine. And why is that?
I'll tell you why. One of the reasons why is that they are sold a bill of goods. They say that there was change or there's going to be change. They don't see it. Okay, even if 3-4 months after the Maidan I left and I came back, people are already discouraged. So there was not an element of hope. That was they had it maybe, but there was an element of expectation that wasn't fulfilled. And what they bought into was the promises of those people who said, right, on the Maidan. And I saw it was like 15, 20 feet away, maybe, you know, maybe 30 feet. 10, 15 meters. We're going to have rule of law. We are going to punish those who are corrupt, okay, and so on and so forth. And what they actually missed was the fact that it wasn't so much that the system had to be reformed. But I want to bring something else in. Ukraine doesn't need reform. Yes, it does, politically. But the question around corruption and the changing of society is about moral transformation. Okay? And so how can you plant democratic seeds in a free society and people say we're going to deal or reform that system when already it's completely dirty? So what I think that people, the cynicism continues simply because we're focusing on the wrong question. We're talking about political reform as opposed to what we should be talking about is attempting to create a structure within the society that will be, that people will be able to participate, take individual responsibility, transform their own lives, extending the existential question, if you will, during the Maidan, which was what type of people do we want to be? That's where it begins. And so when I ask myself, what type of man do I want to be, or woman? And I ask, what does it mean to be good? That's the beginning of the transformation. Once that transformation takes place, right? Or in the process of transformation, and the people begin to take responsibility and then begin to enter into civil society, which many are doing, then you're going to see the transformation. To think that you're going to have reform by those same individuals who replace the other clan with another clan, if you will, you're going to expect that, and it's not going to happen. 3 years, fundamentally, there have been no people sent to prison for the murders that took place on the Maidan. I rest my case that way.
What really does need to happen? I mean, you mentioned this reform by the same people that kind of participated in the corruption, that profited from this corruption, and then now they're introducing themselves as reformists. Right. If they're in power, they're introducing these reformist bills. And if that isn't going to go anywhere, considering they do have this kind of inbuilt aversion to reform. This is how they got rich. To give that up would be giving up their own power. People typically don't do much of that. So what concrete steps can Ukraine really take to absolve itself of this kind of, as I once heard say, this oligarchic parasite on Ukraine's soul?
I would say that from a practical point of view, what's really needed here is a formation, if you will, of a democratic movement. And it should be poza frazioni, beyond party politics. I think what's needed, and I was thinking about this last year in particular, there should actually be a grouping, if you will, of all the major groups, civil societies, politicians, whoever they may be, groups, blessed funds, or people who are working with the homeless or with orphans and so on. All the societies got to get together and they got to write a charter. That's a charter I'm ripping off this Charter 77. But what I think should be done fundamentally before the next elections, okay, before the next election, has to be a grouping, 4,000 or 5,000 people, and that's possible, that is not based on individual characters or personalities, but a democratic movement of the left, the middle, the right, who are going to say and agree to a charter to say, regardless of what our politics or how we're going to be in the Verkhovna Rada, right, that we all are going to participate in the formation of fundamental things that will act as the basis for a democratic society, rule of law, judges, so on and so forth, and that everybody say, this is what we all commit to this. And that's what this Maidan generation can do. They're going to be outspent. Okay,
I mean, this does sound to me like the Maidan. The Maidan didn't really have super visible figureheads. You, of course, had spokesmen. You had people who participated from the very beginning. But in itself, did seem to be this kind of very anarchic democratic movement.
We have to get away from that. Democracy, electoral politics is one thing, but democracy is not based on individuals, it's based on ideas, yes, interests, economic interests, and so on, and on political parties that would represent their particular constituency. You don't have that here. Everything is based on personality, who's got money, and so on, and oligarchic interests. Nobody is actually saying or coming with a whole particular program, or there's no democratic movement that actually is going to say.
So kind of like a sustained Maidan movement.
Right.
That doesn't fizzle out.
That was the purpose of the book. The purpose of the book was to translate the emotion of it. Because you're talking to me about the ideals earlier. Those exist. I think that case is closed. Right? That case is closed. But what you have to do, it is not enough, right, to have emotion. Because political parties and countries are built step by step by step by step, right? So I wanted to translate, if you will, that emotion into fundamental principles, democratic principles that can actually act as a structure and create a language in which we can talk about, in which the country can talk about, and people can say, yes, this is what we want to do. And this is the direction we want to go. So what I wanted to do was to change or translate from the negative language of what we are against, but what we are for. Therefore, if you look at my definition of corruption, right, which is not just stealing and and the rest, you look at that. What is the ideal? What are we for? And so as we talk about that, one of the other key factors of that is that we have to attempt to deconstruct still the Marxist or the communist structures that existed here. If there was a revolution here, those things would be destroyed and or ruined.
Now, you hear a lot about this decommunization that keeps going. For example, the statues of Lament taking down, obvious kind of Soviet symbology being removed. So when you say this persistence of communist thought, what precisely are you referring to?
I'm talking about a mentality, number one. This is without a doubt one of the key things. If you want to go to a place, the decommunization also, it talks about a new way of thinking. That was one of the things that attracted a lot of people with President Poroshenko. He talked about a new way of thinking. Well, you can talk about that as a political slogan. Okay? And it really affects, he actually won. So you know that there's an element of people who actually want to think that way. But there's another aspect. You have to look at the Ukrainian historical narrative, right? How do you think as a free man or a free person? So what you have here is you have a continuation of serfdom, if you will. Then you went to communism. Now you have oligarchism, which is another form of oppression that's following the continuing narrative of the country. Whereas this generation, the Maidan generation, says enough of that paternalism. We've had enough of that paternalism, right? And that's what it was. They rebelled against, the father, if you will, right? And they're finally saying, we want to be free. We want to break the historical narrative of the politics that are here. And so when we talk about decommunization, we're talking about the deconstruction, right, of Marxist thought. What are values? What is freedom? What is justice, right? And so we cannot think that justice is paying the judge to get the right ruling. That's not what it's like. But you see the direction I'm trying to go here. So it's actually a changing of one's mentality from living under oppression, but to start living as a free man. Not waiting for somebody to tell you, but taking on the responsibility to say, we don't want this guy sitting in the mayor's office, whatever it may be, and using that opportunity to sell off property, like I was just told last week. I'm selling off the property. There's one thing that was written in the records, but we know that there was more money.
Yeah,
and people are saying we're going to take responsibility for this.
Yuri, thank you for answering all my questions. This was a very enlightening discussion. I'm very glad that you came in. Today, we've been joined by Yuri Polakiwsky, Ukrainian-Canadian author of Ukraine, A Lament of a Promise. You're watching UATV.